would to the insurance companies. And now we have this joke of Obamacare, which quite frankly, I mean, I'll admit it's better than nothing because there are people that are getting coverage that wouldn't have had it otherwise. But the thing is, it's still privatized, it's still profit driven, and it still is not all inclusive. And by the way, Walter, you know that I'm not the only person that feels that way about voting. The great political activist and civil rights advocate Emma Goldman said almost a century ago, she said that if voting changed anything, they'd make it illegal.
Well, that may or may not be true, but the fact of the matter is if we keep voting for the same two political parties, which is almost like one political party, there's not going to be any change, although there are a few good people in Congress right now other than Bernie Sanders.
Really? Name one.
Alan Grayson from Florida.
Okay, good point. Name another one.
Let me think about it, and I'll get back to you maybe by the next program.
All right. Well, let's move on and talk about some more things here.
Well, I want to talk about the Great Unwashed.
Yeah. Oh, the Great Unwashed.
Yeah, the class that we're in, the Great Unwashed.
Oh, you mean the 99%?
Well, I'd say more like 90%. I think if you're in the top 10%, you're doing pretty well.
Well, that could possibly be true. Maybe even a little bit more than that, but we're definitely not even in the top, 20%?
We're not even in the top 50%, I don't think.
Well, what it boils down to is what the Great Unwashed, our purpose is to, provide money and maybe to a certain extent services to the elite. Would you agree with that?
Well, I would agree with that. In other words, doing their work for them so that they can become rich and then they can, take from our pockets.
Exactly. And another way that they take from our pockets that might be a little less, conspicuous is through taxation. In other words, the government, which is already underfunded, which is why we have austerity and why they're cutting programs for the Great Unwashed. But the fact of the matter is, the revenue that the government generates through taxation is coming mostly from the very people who cannot afford to pay the taxes. But by them taking the money from the rest of us, then that's money that they aren't taking from the, let's say, the top 10% that could afford to fund the government and provide a lot more money for the Treasury so that there wouldn't have to be so many cuts.
But see, the argument is they are the job creators, and if you tax them too much, they're not going to create jobs for people.
Well, what kind of job do you think they're doing right now, creating jobs?
I get your point. Not too good of a job. So now we have to figure out how in the heck to change all that.
Exactly. And that is, again, as I stated earlier, that is the uphill battle because they're not going to go down quietly. And they have the political power and the influence and the money to turn public opinion against higher taxation for them. And a lot of people, unfortunately, particularly the Tea Party, they're buying into it hook, line, and sinker.
And really, the Tea Party is funded pretty much by the Koch brothers.
Exactly.
And corporate interests, so I don't understand how you could even fall into that. It boggles my mind.
Yeah, I don't get it either. But I guess it just goes to show you the power of propaganda and the power of getting people stirred up so that they aren't able to think rationally. They're thinking with their emotions. The people in the Tea Party are angry people. And they've got every right to be because the people for example, in the Occupy movement, they were angry. But I think with the Occupy movement, they knew where to focus that anger. They knew where, the problems were coming from. Whereas what the Tea Party is doing is they're taking that anger and they're focusing it downward against people lower than them, and also making it look like it's high taxes and regulation on corporations that are causing these problems.
It's a lot easier to blame somebody below you than above you.
It is, because there's a psychological payoff to it too, because you kind of feel good about yourself when you can say that all the problems that the world faces are because of the people that are lower than you. Kind of makes you feel like, well, maybe I'm not at the top of the pyramid, but I'm above those people. And another thing is, one of the reasons that socialism never took off in America, I mean, I know we've had some social programs, particularly during the time of the Great Depression with FDR, but full-fledged socialism has never taken off in America, and when it has, it's never lasted. And I think, the person that captured that sentiment probably the best and most succinctly was the writer John Steinbeck, who said that, Americans all see themselves as temporarily embarrassed millionaires.
Well, that's the thing. Socialism, I don't think alone socialism is going to work. I think you have to have a combination of capitalism and socialism. I think that would be socialism to protect those who are near the bottom. In other words, you have to have everybody have a livable wage. But then the argument is, well, if we pay a $15 wage to everybody, your hamburger is going to go up in price. Well, I tend to disagree with that. I think that the guy that owns the restaurant will have to maybe take a little bit of a smaller profit margin. Absolutely. On those hamburgers.
Absolutely, I agree. But people will buy into that, and it's fear mongering. They're going to buy into that idea that they don't want to pay $20 for a hamburger, and and again, you come down to this false dichotomy where it's either going to be a hamburger that's so out of reach that you can't afford it, or you have to pay people a pittance. But the thing is, there's another way. It doesn't have to be that binary paradigm. There is another way, and that is that the owner of the restaurant can take a smaller profit. But yeah, the thing is, we need to have a livable wage. It doesn't matter, where you work. You need to be paid a living wage.
That is correct. For example, in a restaurant, why is it up to the goodness of the patrons to pay the wages for the restaurants? In other words, my meal already costs me 20 to 25% more because I have to leave a tip because the restaurant can get away with paying people $2 an hour. Where's that coming from?
Exactly. And we're even talking not just, your small mom and pop restaurants. We're talking about the major chains. They don't pay their servers minimum wage. They rely on the people to leave tips. And the thing is, then, you're relying, like you said, you're relying on the generosity of people who are already strapped. I mean, let's face it, most people are so strapped these days, but they still decide, well, they want to go out and have a nice meal because, let's face it, they deserve to have a little bit of joy in their life. So they decide we're going to go out for a nice meal tonight. But, here you have someone that's already strapped, and then we have to leave the tip for the waiter or waitress. So the waiter and waitress is relying on our generosity, and if we don't do it, or we can't do it, then the waiter or waitress is getting screwed over, and they're working hard, most of them.
Well, what we need to do is not talk about minimum wage, but talk about livable wage. Every job, if you're working full-time, well, I don't care whether it's full-time or part-time. A livable wage would be, I would say, somewhere between $14 and $15 an hour. That is a livable wage. Everybody should get that wage. And if you want to know where to cut from the top. The top don't need 7 mansions, 10 yachts, 15 automobiles. Come on now.
Absolutely. I've said it before, not on this program, but I've said it, in talks that I've given and things like that, articles I've written, that a legitimate political and economic system needs to do one of two things. They've got to do one of two things, or they're going to have a very unhappy and potentially, a population that could potentially erupt. They need to either have they need to either provide their citizens with basic necessities, the basic necessities of life, or they need to guarantee the means whereby the citizens can provide for themselves. They need to do one or the other. And what that translates to in simple nomenclature is this. Either a social safety net that guarantees everybody, the basics, like a citizen's dividend paid out of the great wealth of the nation, or guaranteed employment with a living wage. Take your pick. But you got to do one or the other. This country does neither.
Well, I think a citizen's dividend would be the best thing. That way you could pick what job you want to do. You don't have to take a job picking up trash or sweeping the sidewalks at an amusement park, for example.
Exactly. And see, that's the problem. When people are desperate and they don't have choices, they will take whatever job comes along, and they have no bargaining power, so they'll take whatever job, they'll work under any conditions, and they'll accept any wage. But the thing is, if everybody had their basic necessities met, I'm not talking about luxuries, I'm just talking about the basic necessities, which is a roof over your head, food on the table, health care, heat, just the basic necessities. You want to get a big screen TV? Well, then you got to work for that. But if everybody had the basic necessities, nobody would be desperate for a job, and nobody would just take anything that comes along and accept that kind of treatment.
Well, work 2 jobs or 3 jobs
exactly,
to keep their head above water.
Exactly, and still barely make it, and meanwhile they're exhausted. And forget about the fact that they might have children. How can you be a good parent when you're completely mentally and emotionally exhausted and physically exhausted at the end of the day after working 2 or 3 jobs? When did it ever become kind of like a bragging right in this country to work? I remember back, it wasn't long, it was when President Bush, George Bush II, was in office, and it was at some kind of a news, some kind of a program that he was on, and a woman was talking about how, she works 2 jobs and blah, blah, blah. And he basically said that's so American. When did that become the goal, to have 2 or 3 jobs? No, that's not, I didn't get that then, and I don't get it now.
Well, it's because if you work 2 or 3 jobs, you're serving the elite much more by doing that. If you can devote, 80% of your awake time to serving the ruling class, that's what they want.
That's exactly right. And you know what? When you're working like that and you're ragged, it's also going to make you not have the energy to invest in trying to change the system and make it more just, because you're going to be too exhausted. Yeah, I mean, who's going to have time working 2 or 3 jobs and still having a family maybe to take care of, and you got to sleep, a couple hours in there. So when is there time to actually become engaged politically?
Well, that does make it tough, but people are going to have to figure out a way to do it, because that's about the only way anything's going to change.
Exactly.
But anyway, we should mention that my viewpoints here for this show, I'm basically a social libertarian. I believe in, the government staying off of people's backs when it comes to social issues. But I think on economics, I want a well-regulated economic system, because that prevents the haves from taking advantage of the have-nots, which is what we have now.
Oh, absolutely, Walter, and I agree with you 100%, and I would take basically the same position. I might be a little more radical than you maybe in some areas, but definitely in that area I would agree. In fact, I would say that that's what a legitimate government is supposed to do. A legitimate government is supposed to regulate commerce and the economy to make sure that we have an equal outcome for everybody. But it's somehow we've gotten this convoluted idea that that's exactly what the government is not supposed to be doing. But instead, they're supposed to be regulating what goes on in people's private lives, what people do in their bedrooms, who people marry, what people put into their bodies. Suddenly, that seems to be what the government is supposed to be doing. Well, I do see, it looks like the clock done got us here, Walter.
Oh, already?
Yes!
Well, we'll be back then in probably a week or so. We'll do it all over again. We'll hit some interesting subjects, I'm sure.
Absolutely, and I want to thank everybody for joining us here at the Democracy Savers. Please join us next time. We've got a lot of great things we're going to be talking about throughout the upcoming programs. For Walter Capone, this is Ralph Dillinger saying thanks for listening.